So far, what we've considered are waves that move along, and as they do, they transfer energy. And because they're transferring energy, we can say that these waves are progressive as they progress along. But what I'd like to look at now are another type of wave, and this kind of wave, it doesn't transfer energy, but it stores it. And what we're going to look at instead are waves that don't seem to move at all, and these are called standing or stationary waves. So it's these standing or stationary waves where we store energy, and they're quite different to the progressive waves that you've been used to so far. So how are these waves formed? Well, if we have a progressive wave that is moving along and it reflects off some kind of boundary or perhaps an endpoint, the reflected wave will come back, and this time the reflected wave will have the same kind of amplitude and phase difference, and it's the interaction of these two waves where we look at superposition and the overall resultant that gives us a standing wave. What I'm going to look at here is a series of standing waves that we can have set up perhaps on a string, and provided we have a fixed end at both sides, the wave that we set up can't move up and down at the end because it's in a fixed position. And what I have here is the first standing wave that we produce, and what we have is at the end it can't move, and this is what we call a node, or effectively there's no displacement at the node. We also have a point of maximum displacement, which is an opposite to a node, and this is what we call an antinode. And all I've drawn in here is effectively the maximum and the minimum position of perhaps a string which is vibrating. I can repeat it for perhaps the second kind of standing wave that we can fit in. So again, we're going to have the ends must be constrained, but this time there's another wave that is actually the length of one complete wavelength. And if I draw that as one of its waveforms, the opposite to this at the other extreme, half a cycle later, looks a bit like this. And again, we have a node at each end. We also have a node, or a point of no displacement in the middle, and then we have an antinode and another antinode. Now the key thing about this is that because this is one wavelength, the distance from a node to another antinode is equal to the wavelength of that wave over 2. In this one here, this is also equal to the wavelength over 2, and so on. And if we repeat the process, what we have here, although slightly dodgily drawn, we do have various other standing waves that can be set up within the same distance. From the diagram so far, they all look a bit static, so this is what it would look like. Here we have a couple of nodes and the particles moving up and down in the middle, and then we also have another wave that has 3 nodes and also one that has 4. Looking in a bit more detail at these various diagrams here, perhaps we have a string that has length L. And what we have here is the first standing wave that we can produce. What we call this is the fundamental. For this fundamental, because the length is equal to the wavelength over 2, we can say that the wavelength is equal to 2L. And this happens at a certain frequency, which we call F0 or F0. And that is the fundamental frequency of that standing wave. Now there's another one here. This time, what we call this is the second harmonic. The reason being that the fundamental frequency is the first harmonic, and the second harmonic, the wavelength is equal to the length of that string, and we call this, where it basically has twice the frequency of the first one. And what we then have is the third and the fourth. And what we find with many musical instruments is that because we have all these harmonics, we have various multiples of that fundamental frequency. So what we find is that there are a number of modes of vibration, various harmonics, and we still have the nodes and antinodes, and as we have a higher and higher frequency, we can see the wavelength gets smaller and smaller.
The illusion of motion deceives everyone, so that the profound laws have been written by scientists which don't have the slightest foundation of truth in them, much less the very fundamental laws that I could see behind the scenes. When I came back, I bought textbooks to find out the names of that which I knew in space, in the universe, in another way as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 4, 3, 2, 1, and back to 0. That is all I needed to know. And the names of those 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. are in textbooks: lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, one series of elements after another. But to me they were always 1, 2, 3, 4, 0. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in everything. Whether that was the octave spectrum of color or the octave on the piano, every expression of motion is in the octave wave, and I knew the wave. And in the wave is the secret of creation, and I had that. I knew it in a timeless flash.
Holographic self-similarity follows in the magnetic model, but what magnetism is most definitely what people do not understand. As was said long ago by Faraday, magnetism is the dielectric field. Dielectricity is the inertia. The loss of that inertia manifests itself in a geometric form pattern, but that form pattern is not three-dimensional. It is resultantly and demonstrably so three-dimensional in that it has volume, but magnetism itself is two-dimensional. It is only resultantly three-dimensional and contains and creates volume. It is not voluminous, but it is by definition that which creates volume by nature of the mass which it must transverse. Here we can actually see the hypertoroidal pattern that you actually find underneath the ferrocell, as evidenced here from one of my videos, and here, as you can see 1,000 times over, the quote-unquote spirograph-like pattern that forms the construct. What these are constructive and destructive interferences, as commonly found in the double slit experiment, but unfortunately, modern science being the bullshit that it is, slit experiment, but unfortunately, modern science being the bullshit that it is, it thinks that light is both particle and wave, but it is neither particle nor is it a wave. A wave is not a thing, rather what something does. And certainly so, there's no such thing as a photon. That is misunderstanding the coaxial nature of light, which a longitudinal pulse perturbation with resultant transverse electrical magnetic components, necessitatively so, resultant to its propagation. But the propagation is in the field itself. Nothing is propagating in the sense of an object moving from point A to point B, but these are constructive and destructive interferences of the resultant divergent centrifugal magnetism interacting with the increasing inertia and acceleration of the centrifugal. But the centrifugal is not magnetism per se, not specifically denotatively, but we can say that it is so superficially so. This is the confusion of the misunderstanding by everybody in the world as to the conjugate nature and the relationship of magnetism to dielectricity. We can't say that the head side of a coin is something completely different than the tail side of the coin. Obviously, they both entail the coin. Or actually, specifically would be the case, the head and the tail would be the magnetism, but the silver of which the coin is made would be the dielectricity. You certainly do not have the magnetism without the dielectricity, or the dielectric silver, as if we were in that analogy. Let's take a look at the central toroid. We'll actually see here a two-dimensional model. Here we have a three-dimensional representation. This conjugate geometry, if we actually take the inverse of the toroid, we have the hourglass pattern of the hyperboloid, which forms the conjugate nature with the toroidal, the creation of not space and volume itself, but magnetism and space and volume are synonymous. The loss of that inertia as manifest three-dimensionally loss of that inertia as manifest three-dimensionally only results into the necessary mass which it must transverse, and which resultantly is the therefore rise of phase, and is therefore the rise resultantly of voluminous gyromagnetic precession. We actually have to understand two-dimensional geometry. We have to understand what the hypertrochoidal is. We also have to understand what gyromagnetic precession is. We can actually do, or you could do specifically, a lookup on what gyromagnetic precession is, and specifically two-dimensional Poincaré disk model of projective geometry, which necessitatively spells out the nature of a two-dimensional model as projected in three-dimensional geometry. Now let's actually show that with a really simple program here. Here you can actually see the pattern of the ferrocell on this simple two-dimensional pattern, which will draw out in 360 degrees a circle. Well, you don't see a circle here, you see a top-down view of the torus. A circle. Well, you don't see a circle here, you see a top-down view of the torus, obviously so. And here we have it underneath the ferrocell of constructive and destructive interference. And of course we have the black spot where no constructive or destructive interference is occurring. We have the top part of the hyperboloid, or the top of the hourglass if you were, showing the field geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration, i.e. the dielectric. The two of these together are the conjugate, which define one another. The dielectric defines the magnetic, and the magnetic defines the field geometry of the dielectric. So let's erase this and start over. And here's where we'll have to understand, and you'll have to research what it is the Poincaré disk model of projective geometry. And all I'm going to do, I needed to find the center to do this. All I'm going to do is draw a circle as best I can. Only a circle, but it will be manifest in replication in 360 degrees opposite to where I'm drawing it, and also 90 degrees and 45 degrees and so on. I think with 18 manifestations, but all I'm doing is drawing a simple circle. But here we have, and let's do it again, except try to be more perfect since I'm doing this by hand. Here we have the hypertrochoidal pattern, which shows the magnetic circle. The only way the loss of inertia manifests itself is the manifestation of a circle. It's a two-dimensional circle. But magnetism is three-dimensional, or is the creation of three-dimensional space. Well, this is necessitatively only due and resultant to the mass that it is three-dimensional. Magnetism itself, if we were to take a point of inertia, which is certainly so a nonsensical term since there is no point, inertia itself is non-Cartesian. It is by definition counter space and the true definition of what energy is. But if we were to take a single point and apply the loss of that inertia, which follows 1 over 5 to the power of -3, we will see what we have is actually just a two-dimensional circle, where the loss of pure potential is Cartesianally manifest in a circle and replicated here in fullness. You'll actually see we actually have what appears to be a three-dimensional top-down torus. And this, of course, is what we see in the ferrocell. Magnetism is two-dimensional. Inertia, the loss of that inertia, and this, of course, is perfectly in line with the holographic model of the nature of the universe. Magnetism is only three-dimensional, resultant to the nature of the mass, by which it must, if coherent, reciprocate itself to termination. Really, it is an expanding circle. Nothing is moving like my cursor is currently, moving outwards as you see my cursor is moving. We actually have, technically, I could draw this same two-dimensional geometry by showing an increasing circle going from an infinitesimally small point, will actually be a counterpoint in counter space, to a larger and larger and larger and larger and larger circle. So That would actually be, according to the geometry of the nature of magnetism, the way in which I would, quote, draw the loss of inertia would be an increasing circle instead of a point moving out and then moving back again. Instead of a point moving out and then moving back again, kind of like a comet going around the sun, it would just be an increasing circle and then a decreasing one. Upon termination, nothing is emitted by the loss of that inertia from counter space, but saying from implies our Cartesian coordinate, but counter space has no point by which we may define from, so we would actually have to imagine this as an expanding circle and then a contracting one, and then apply our understanding of geomagnetic precession, because the loss of inertia and polarity is only denotatively the inverse of counter space. There's obviously no such thing as a monopole, but polarity two-dimensionally is not a north pole and a south pole. A magnet doesn't have poles, it has the inverse of counter space. The loss of that inertia is manifest, obviously so, three-dimensionally, resultant to the mass of which it is present therein, i.e. the coherent magnetic field. So we not only have the divergence and the phase, but we have the geomagnetic precession, which draws out, if you will, for lack of a better term, this toroidal, because the inverse image of this torus is the hyperboloid. The hourglass, that is the negative image of a torus. The inverse of an hourglass is a torus, and the inverse of a torus is the hyperboloid. These form the geometry of force and motion, and the inverse geometry to that, inertia and acceleration. Everything begins with inertia and acceleration, within which we actually have a rate of decay of loss of inertia, which therefore manifests itself resultantly as the hypertoroidal two-dimensional, or the magnetic field. But magnetism is not something different from dielectricity. Magnetism is just the manifestation of dielectricity. I kind of drew that really crooked. Magnetism is the manifestation of dielectricity as resultant to the loss of its energy, which is counter space, is pure potential, is pure energy, pure non-Cartesian actuality. This is true power is rest, not manifestation of power. One might think ignorantly, as any human being would, that power would be an atomic bomb going off, for example. Well, that's true power. True power, one might think. But obviously, it's just the inverse of that, magnetism being analogous to the explosion itself, but that is impotency. The release of that power, the release of that energy is force and motion. It is the absolute loss of true power. True power would be that 3-pound lump of plutonium that sits in your hand like an innocent baseball. I mean, that is true power. That is about the closest analogy I could draw. I kind of drew that crooked there. It's hard to draw a perfect circle freehand like this on a computer screen to get the hypertoroidal pattern, but I think you get it now. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, just click the link below. Anything to expand your mind. But this is the secret of Mother Nature, the conjugate nature of magnetism and dielectricity. Both are inextricably connected at the very core. One, magnetism is not something different than dielectricity. Magnetism would what we'd be calling, what we would denotatively and ignorantly call force, but it's not force. It is simply the loss of inertia that we understand to be dielectricity, or the counterspatial pure energy of the nature of the universe. Its manifestation being force and motion. We therefore call it something else, even though it is not something else. We call it magnetism, but there is not an autonomous field modality known as magnetism. It is simply an expression of the loss of the potential of dielectricity, which must only and necessitatively form the geometry which we call magnetism, which is the creation of space and volume and force and motion. All of these are one and the same thing. That's the power as manifest, but not the power in true, which is completely unmanifest, necessitatively and logically so.